5,000 jackscrews. That's what it took to lift the Tremont House, a 6-story brick hotel on the corner of Lake and Dearborn, straight up into the air in January of 1861, while 500 men turned those screws in a single coordinated rhythm, and the guests upstairs kept eating breakfast. Nobody checked out. Nobody evacuated. A journalist who watched it happen wrote that a man could stand a glass of water on a windowsill and it wouldn't spill. I want to start with that image because it's the one everybody knows, the crowd-pleasing version, the spectacle that gets replayed in every documentary about Chicago's early history. What almost none of them show you is the ledger. The building permit ledger, the one that survives in fragments in the city archive, the one that records what actually happened to hundreds of other buildings during the exact same years. And what it shows doesn't match the postcard. Here's what we're told. Chicago in the 1850s was built on a swamp, low, flat, poorly drained, sitting barely above the level of Lake Michigan itself, and it was killing people. Streets turned to standing muck after every hard rain, deep enough in places that signs were reportedly posted warning that a fallen horse in the mud shouldn't be pulled out too quickly because the suction could drown it before help arrived. Whether every version of that story is literally true or slightly exaggerated by a later retelling, the underlying condition it describes was not exaggerated at all. Standing water-bred disease, and Chicago's death registries through the 1840s and 1850s show wave after wave of cholera moving through the city with a regularity that terrified anyone who could read them. The germ theory of disease didn't exist yet in any form city planners could act on. What they understood correctly even without the microbiology to explain why was that stagnant water and human waste sitting close together at ground level was making people sick, and that the city's flat, swampy footprint made proper drainage physically impossible under the existing grade. In 1855, a young engineer named Ellis Chesbrough was tasked with solving it, and the solution he proposed sounded almost too simple to work, right up until you tried to imagine actually building it. Chicago couldn't dig a conventional sewer system below its streets because the water table sat too close to the surface for gravity drainage to function the way it did in a hillier city. Trenches would simply fill with groundwater as fast as workers could dig them. So Chesbrough proposed doing the opposite of digging down. Build the sewer pipes essentially at the existing ground surface, then bury those pipes under an entirely new layer of fill, and lay the new streets on top of that fill at a grade several feet higher than the original city. Gravity would finally have somewhere to pull the wastewater toward. The catch, the part that turned an engineering plan into a city-wide spectacle, was that raising the street didn't just mean building new roads. It meant every single structure fronting that street now sat below the new grade unless something was done about it. The City Council approved Chesbrough's plan in 1855 and 1856, and what followed, according to the version everyone tells, was one of the greatest engineering spectacles of the 19th century. Entire city blocks lifted whole into the air on thousands of jackscrews, while life inside continued completely undisturbed. That part is true. I want to be precise about that, because this isn't a story about a myth. It's a story about what the myth left out. In 1858, workers used jackscrews to raise a masonry building on Lake Street 6 feet 2 inches, the first of what would eventually be more than 50 comparable lifts that year alone. In 1860, a consortium of contractors, among them a young man named George Pullman, who would go on to build an entire company town on the strength of what he learned doing this, coordinated the lift of an entire half-block on Lake Street between Clark and LaSalle, a continuous run of 4- and 5-story masonry buildings 320 feet long, raised 4 feet 8 inches into the air by 600 men working 6,000 jackscrews in unison. And then, in January of 1861, Pullman's team, working alongside contractors Ely and Smith, took on the Tremont House itself, 6 stories, brick, occupying more than an acre of ground, the largest hotel in the city, lifted while fully occupied, 500 men on 5,000 screws. Each one turned a fraction of an inch at a time, in a sequence precise enough that nothing inside the building so much as rattled. If a story about 500 men lifting an occupied hotel without spilling a drop of water is the kind of engineering history that deserves more attention than it gets, subscribe to the Historia Archive now, because I want you here for the part where this story stops being a spectacle and starts being something closer to a cover story. Before we get there, it's worth sitting for a moment with how completely the lifted version of this story has taken over public memory. Ask almost anyone who has heard of Chicago's street raising at all, and they'll describe the same handful of details: the jackscrews, the hotel, the guests who supposedly never noticed, sometimes even the detail about the water glass that didn't spill. It shows up in trivia lists, in engineering history documentaries, in offhand references on architecture tours through the loop. It's a genuinely great story, and none of it is wrong. But a great story that gets repeated enough times starts to function like the entire truth, simply because nothing else is competing for the same attention. Nobody grows up hearing the companion story, the one about the bricklayer and the sealed doorway, because that story never had a 500-man crew or a hotel full of witnesses to make it memorable in the moment it happened. Here's the first anomaly, and it's sitting in plain sight in the permit records if you know to look for it. The jackscrew lifts, the ones everybody remembers, required an enormous, genuinely staggering amount of coordinated labor. 500 men, 600 men, thousands of jackscrews, each one needing to be turned in careful synchronization with every other screw on the site, because turning them unevenly could crack a masonry structure in half. This was not cheap, it was not fast, and it was absolutely not something every property owner in Chicago could afford to do to their building. So here's the question nobody puts in the documentary. If the street grade was rising across the entire city, and it was, what happened to the buildings whose owners couldn't pay for 500 men and 5,000 jackscrewflessos? The city's answer, when you actually go looking for it in the municipal record, was almost shockingly hands-off. The raising of Chicago was never a single unified municipal construction project executed uniformly across every property. It was closer to a mandate with options attached. Property owners were told the new grade was coming and then largely left to decide for themselves how to meet it. Move the building, lift the building, or do nothing to the building itself, and simply build up around it instead, sealing what used to be the ground floor beneath the new sidewalk and constructing a new entrance at the new street level. That third option, the cheap option, the option that required no jackscrews and no coordinated labor crew at all, was the one that ordinary working-class property owners overwhelmingly chose. They didn't lift their homes into the sky for a newspaper illustration. They walled off the old front door, cut a new one in on the second floor, added stairs or a small bridge down to what used to be the upper level, and let the original ground floor simply disappear beneath the rising street, filled in, buried, and forgotten by everyone except the person who still owned the deed to a room that no longer had a door. Here's what makes this discrepancy worth sitting with, rather than shrugging off. The lifted buildings, the ones you see in every illustration, were concentrated almost entirely in the commercial core. The hotels, the printeries, the retail blocks along Lake Street, buildings whose owners had the capital to justify the extraordinary expense of a coordinated lift, because a 5-story masonry commercial building was worth protecting at full value, floor by floor, with none of it sacrificed. Out in the working-class neighborhoods, in the areas that would eventually become Pilsen, Bridgeport, and back of the yards, the calculation was completely different. A modest brick or timber home wasn't worth the cost of hiring a jackscrew crew. It was worth the cost of bricking up a doorway and adding a staircase. Multiply that decision across a few thousand individual property owners making the same practical choice independently for the same practical reason, and you get a city-wide pattern that never required anyone to coordinate anything. No ordinance told people to bury their ground floors. No committee decided it. It happened piecemeal, house by house, driven by nothing more mysterious than the price of labor. And it left behind a version of Chicago that the spectacle story simply has no room for. You can still see the result today. And this is the part that genuinely surprises people who grew up thinking the jackscrew story was the whole story. Walk through Pilsen or Bridgeport or back of the yards, and you'll find houses where the original ground floor windows sit at or below current sidewalk level, half sunken into the earth, bricked up, or converted into small ground-level openings that clearly used to be something else. What you're looking at is not subsidence, and it's not a basement that was always a basement. It's a literal, physical record of a street that rose around a building that never moved, entombing its original entrance in place, while the rest of the block re-leveled itself overhead. These aren't rare. They're scattered across entire neighborhoods, hiding in plain sight, and most of the people walking past them every day have no idea they're looking at the losing side of a decision made by a property owner more than a century and a half ago who simply couldn't afford to be lifted. Local reporters covering these neighborhoods in recent years have gone looking for exactly this pattern and found it repeatedly: small brick cottages with a visibly older, lower window line running along the base of the structure, a second entrance cut in higher up, and, in a few documented cases, a homeowner who can point to the exact spot in their own basement where the bricked-up original doorway still sits behind a coat of paint, discovered only when a renovation project opened the wall up. None of this required a demolition crew to find. It required someone standing still long enough to notice that a window that should be at eye level is actually somewhere around their shins. Once you know to look for the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere in these neighborhoods, house after house, telling the same quiet story in slightly different brickwork. If the idea that ordinary Chicago neighborhoods are quietly full of buried 19th century ground floors, still sitting exactly where they were sealed, is the kind of forensic detail you want more of, go ahead and subscribe now, because that's precisely the gap this channel keeps digging into. The places where the postcard version and the permit ledger stop agreeing with each other. It's worth pausing on just how enormous the labor gap actually was between these two options, because the scale is what makes the whole citywide pattern make sense. A jackscrew lift on the order of the Tremont House required 500 trained men working in exact coordination. 5,000 individual screws, each one needing to be turned a fraction of a rotation at a time in careful sequence across the entire footprint of the building. Because turning even one section faster than its neighbors could twist a masonry structure hard enough to crack its walls or shatter its foundation. That kind of precision labor didn't come cheap in $1861, and it required a level of technical supervision that only a handful of specialized contracting firms in the entire country could provide. Pullman, Ely, and Smith built their reputations, and in Pullman's case an entire fortune, precisely because so few outfits could execute a lift like this without destroying the building in the process. Compare that to what a bricklayer needed to seal a doorway and frame in a new entrance 1 story up. A handful of workers, a few days, ordinary materials any hardware supplier in the city already stocked. There was no contest between the two options for anyone whose building wasn't already worth the enormous premium a coordinated lift demanded, and in a city where the overwhelming majority of residential structures were modest wood frame or single coarse brick cottages that described nearly everyone. So why does the spectacle version dominate every retelling, while the buried version, which was actually the more common outcome citywide, barely gets mentioned? Part of the answer is simply that a hotel rising into the air with breakfast still being served is an unbeatable visual, the kind of image a newspaper illustrator in 1861 was always going to draw, and the kind of image a modern documentary producer is always going to reach for first. Nobody illustrates a bricklayer quietly sealing a doorway. It doesn't move the same way on a page or a screen. But there's a second, less flattering reason buried in the historical record itself, and it has to do with whose buildings got remembered in the first place. The lifted buildings were the commercial landmarks, the hotels and printeries whose owners had the money and the motive to have their achievement documented, photographed, and celebrated in the press of the day. The buried buildings belonged to working people whose names rarely made it into any newspaper at all, whose only surviving record of the decision is a fragile line in a permit ledger or a property deed, the kind of document that takes a researcher physically opening a box in an archive to ever see again. History, in this case, wasn't erased by anyone with a motive to hide it. It was simply recorded unevenly from the very beginning, because the people with cameras and printing presses were standing in front of the hotels, not the sealed doorways 2 neighborhoods over. There's a second layer to this worth mentioning, because it explains why tracking down the buried version of the story is so much harder than reading about the lifted one. The building permit ledgers from this era in Chicago are not a single, tidy, digitized database anyone can search from home. They survive in fragments, scattered across the city archive and the collections of local historical societies, some of them water-damaged, some transcribed only partially by volunteer researchers over the decades, and virtually none of them cross-referenced against each other in any systematic way. A researcher trying to establish exactly how many buildings across the city chose the sealed doorway option instead of the jackscrew lift is not pulling up a spreadsheet. They're working page by page through handwritten entries cross-checking property addresses against modern maps and building the picture one confirmed case at a time. That is precisely the kind of slow, unglamorous archival labor that never makes it into a 20-minute explainer video, and precisely the kind of labor that a hotel rising into the sky in front of a newspaper illustrator never required in the first place. The lifted buildings got remembered because they were easy to document in the moment. The buried buildings only get remembered now because someone is willing to go back and do the harder, slower work of finding them. That's the actual answer to the question this investigation opened with, and I think it's worth saying plainly, rather than leaving it hanging the way this kind of story usually does. Chicago's street grade really did rise, in most places, somewhere between 4 and 14 feet, over roughly a 5-year window built around the 1856 sewer ordinance. The jackscrew lifts really did happen, exactly as dramatically as advertised, for the buildings whose owners could afford them. And for every other building in the city, the ones without the capital to justify 500 men and 5,000 screws. The rise happened anyway, just quietly from the outside in, until the ground floor simply wasn't the ground floor anymore. Nobody buried Chicago on purpose. Chicago got buried by arithmetic, one property owner's budget at a time, and what's left of it is still down there under Pilsen, under Bridgeport, under back of the yards, in rooms nobody has opened the original front door of since sometime in the 1860s. It also means the two halves of this story were never actually in competition with each other, even though only one of them made it into the popular memory. The lifted buildings and the buried buildings were two branches of the exact same municipal ordinance, two entirely rational responses to the exact same new street grade, sorted almost perfectly by wealth. Wealth bought you 500 men and a hotel that never lost a single day of business. The absence of wealth bought you a bricked-up doorway and a staircase, and if you were patient enough, decades later, a house that looked from the street like it had simply been built a little strangely, its true history sitting silent behind the brick. Both outcomes solved the drainage problem. Both outcomes met the new grade. Only one of them was ever going to end up in a newspaper illustration, and only one of them is the version most people have ever heard. What strikes me most, working back through the permit fragments that do survive, is how ordinary the decision looked from the inside. Nobody thought of it as sealing something away forever. A bricklayer walled off a doorway on a Tuesday afternoon, charged his client a fair price for an afternoon's work, and moved on to the next job on the block. The homeowner upstairs adjusted, hung a new address number by the new door, and got on with their life. Nobody involved in that transaction imagined they were creating a time capsule. They were solving an immediate, practical problem, the cheapest way available to them, the same way people have solved immediate, practical problems in every city, in every century. It's only from this distance, a century and a half later, that the accumulated weight of thousands of these small, unremarkable Tuesday afternoons starts to look like something closer to a buried city, hiding in the foundations of a modern one, waiting for someone to notice that the window at their feet used to be at eye level. And once you start noticing it in Chicago, you start wondering whether it happened anywhere else, whether some other city, facing some other disaster, reached for exactly the same two options: lift what you can afford to lift, bury what you can't, without ever writing that choice down as policy. It turns out the answer is yes, and the next city didn't even have a swamp to blame. It had a fire. If you want to keep tracing exactly this kind of forensic thread through American urban history, the receipts, the ledgers, the ordinary decisions that add up to something nobody planned, subscribe to the Historia Archive and stay close, because Chicago is only the first city in this particular investigation, and the pattern gets a lot harder to write off as coincidence once you see what happened in the next one. Thank you for watching. Next time you're in a neighborhood with sidewalk-level windows, sitting oddly low against a building's brickwork, look closer. You might be standing on top of somebody's 1858 front door, sealed by a bricklayer who never once thought he was making history disappear, just making his afternoon's work pay. Let me know in the comments if there's a buried flaw like this near you, whether you've seen it in Chicago or somewhere else entirely, because I have a feeling this pattern is a lot less local than any of us were taught. I'll see you in the next investigation.